I am Karen with the Napa Book Mine, and I'm so pleased to be with you tonight. And I wanted to go over a few things before we get started. Many of you have already muted yourself, but if you have a question, our guest tonight will be delivering a presentation of the information in his book, and then there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions. You can put them in chat and I can pose them for you, or you can pose them yourself. At that time, you can just unmute or raise your hand and I will call on you. And I know we're all fairly experienced with Zoom this late in the game, but as a reminder, if you want to lose the Brady Bunch look, click on the speaker view in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. We love seeing your faces here, but if you're more comfortable turning off video, please feel free to do so. And we're recording tonight's conversation for you to view later and share with your friends. We'll be sending you an email as soon as that is ready for you to view on YouTube. And lastly, I encourage you to check out our other events on our website, or follow us on social media, Instagram and Facebook. Consider supporting our author tonight, Thor Hanson, at our local bookstore. Purchase the book through our website, and I'll be placing a link in the chat during our time together tonight. Okay, let's check one last time for any late arrivals. I think we're good. So I'm ready to introduce our guest. Here we go. Hang on one second. Again, I'm Karen Provenza with Napa Book Mine, and I'm pleased to be here with you tonight with celebrated biologist Thor Hanson to talk about his latest book, Hurricane Lizards and Plastic Squid, the fraught and fascinating biology of climate change. I never thought I'd put those two things together, but I can't wait to hear how they merge. And with Congress poised to pass a $555 billion plan to fight climate change within days, this conversation couldn't be more timely. Thor Hanson tells the remarkable story of how plants and animals are responding to climate change, adjusting, evolving, sometimes dying out. And only lizards have grown larger toe pads to grip more tightly in frequent hurricanes. Warm waters cause the development of the Humboldt squid to alter so dramatically that fishermen mistake them for different species. Brown pelicans move north, long-spined sea urchins south to find cooler homes. It's a story of hope, resilience, and risk. Hurricane Lizards and Plastic Squid is a reminder of how unpredictable climate change is as it interacts with the messy lattice of life. More about Thor himself. He researched, and his research and conservation activities have taken him around the globe. He's studied in Central America, studied trees and songbirds and the grizzly feeding habits of African vultures, and he served in the US Peace Corps, volunteering in Uganda, where he helped establish the mountain gorilla tourism program. He also helped manage a brown bear tourism project for the US Forest Service in Alaska. He often works at the interface between natural and human systems and has conducted research on habitat fragmentation, endangered species, and the ecological impacts of warfare. In addition to his writing, he consults for conservation groups and government agencies and is a sought-after public speaker. You may recognize him from the PBS Nature series, American Spring Live, or perhaps you've heard him on NPR's Fresh Air or Science Friday. And I believe you are ready for me to hand this over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Karen. A nice introduction, and thanks to all of you for joining us here for this virtual event. We all cross our fingers and pray to the Zoom gods whenever we try one of these things. And at the moment, I'm going to do a fancy Zoom trick. We're hoping that I can share my screen. Go up here to share the portion. And I hope that now you all see a picture of a book cover. Nod your head if this is the truth. Ah, good, thumbs up, splendid. So I want to launch right into our time together this evening with an image that's far more familiar to all of us than the cover of my book, and that is this. The lonely polar bear stranded on a shrinking iceberg. You know, this has really become our go-to picture, a symbol, if you will, for the biological impacts of climate change. And I think far too often we see this picture and then the conversation stops there. In all sorts of public discourse, we invoke the poor polar bear and then move on. And in doing so, we tend to overlook a dramatic and vital biological story, what's going on with other species all across this planet that is really at the heart of all climate change scenarios. Because it's not really the change itself that matters, it's how plants and animals respond to that change. The reactions of species on this planet will determine the future, theirs as well as our own. Because, if all species got along in the same conditions, then, you could tweak the weather all you wanted, it wouldn't matter in the slightest. But of course, we know that's not how nature works. The diversity of life on this planet is this wonderful accumulation of specialties, if you will, specialization, that iterative, adaptive process of evolution leading to this great accumulation of species, each one adapted to particular relationships and niches out in the environment. So when you change that environment, all of these creatures react in some way. And that is the subject of my latest research and this book. So I want this evening to focus upon the challenges that climate change creates for this potpourri of species, and how we can already see and measure responses playing out all around us in real time. We won't be talking much about the process of climate change itself, the atmospheric stuff. We won't be talking about that much at all, except for carbon dioxide. I mean, has there ever been a substance so often invoked and so seldom explained as carbon dioxide? I realized when I began this project that I hardly knew anything about the stuff that was making the planet warm in the first place. I mean, I do remember from high school biology, the CO2 molecule, big black ball in the middle being the carbon, and then two red balls on either side being the atoms of oxygen. And at the time, I recall thinking that that looked exactly like the head of the red-eyed fruit flies that we had spent the last semester studying in biology. And that association has stuck with me ever since. So that when this connection between CO2 and climate change became so notorious, all I could picture was the tailpipes and smokestacks of the world emitting these clouds and clouds of tiny flies, which is a very vivid image, but not perhaps very helpful in explaining what was going on. Because carbon dioxide is a bit of a mystery. It's a bit of a paradox in that it is a threat globally, but also one of the building blocks for life on Earth. It's everywhere in the atmosphere. In fact, it was one of the first atmospheric gases ever to be described and studied. Before scientists discovered CO2, they weren't sure whether the atmosphere contained anything at all, or if you could even measure it. So that discovery, or a lot of the early work on carbon dioxide, played out in the work of this man here, Joseph Priestley, who was a fabulous 18th century thinker. He was a clergyman. He was a friend of Benjamin Franklin. He was a great chemist. He was a philosopher. He was just an all-around polymath. And he credits his discoveries and studies of carbon dioxide to the fact that he happened to be living next door to, and I'll quote him here, "I was living for some time in the neighborhood of a public brewery." And that meant that he was right next door to this place where they were brewing beer. And above those fermentation vats, he found clouds, if you will, invisible clouds of this colorless and odorless gas collecting there. He was also lucky enough to find brewers in that establishment that were patient enough to allow him to erect scaffolds over the tops of these vats and then lower in all manner of experiments. They let him do this for weeks on end, even at times when the experiments would spoil the flavor of the beer. They were extremely patient with their local vicar. And he was up there doing all these things, lowering things down in there to see what would happen. He learned that it would snuff out a candle flame and he began to understand that this gas, whatever it was heavy, because he could see the smoke from the flame going over the edge of the vats and spreading across the brewery floor. He learned that plants and insects lowered into it would change. Insects and the small animals couldn't breathe this stuff, whatever it was. All of these discoveries he was making, he realized that he could dissolve it in water. By sloshing water back and forth, he could dissolve this gas in water and create a fizzy beverage with what he called a pleasant, acidulous taste. Now, that breakthrough earned him the prestigious Copley Medal from the Fellows of the Royal Society in London. But it earned quite a lot more for an entrepreneur of that era named Johann Schwepp, who read Priestley's paper and copied his methods to found the soda water and tonic water company that still bears his name. So Priestley's work paved the way for all sorts of things, including a lot more research on carbon dioxide, including Tyndall here working on it, discovering that it could absorb and hold on to radiant heat. And as early as the 1890s, scientists predicted that industrial activities were adding enough CO2 to the atmosphere to warm the planet. In the 1890s, this was discovered. Of course, that work was done in snowy Sweden, where the idea of warming the planet by a few degrees was generally greeted with gusto. No one thought that would be a problem at all. So we have known about carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas for a long, long time. But that still doesn't explain why some of it is a threat and some of it is benign. To get my head around this distinction, I decided I wanted to get my hands on some CO2. And that is what brought me to the refrigerator in our house and a little experiment that I conducted with my young son, Noah. And I'd like to share that story with you right out of the book. This comes from the second chapter, which begins with a quotation attributed to Galileo. We must measure all that is measurable and strive to make measurable all that is not. It turns out that fermentation occurs in a lot more places than vats of beer. Yogurt and cheese makers call it culturing, but it's more accurate to think of it as a form of slow microbial digestion, a way for bacteria and other tiny organisms to extract and use energy from the foods they live within and around. Like any form of digestion, it is a process that produces waste. Luckily for food lovers, the byproducts of fermentation include things like alcohol, thus the beer, and lactic acid, which adds tanginess and pungency to such cultured favorites as kimchi and buttermilk. Most fermentation also produces carbon dioxide, which is what had me combing through the back reaches of our fridge. A container of organic sauerkraut advertised probiotic punch and claimed it's alive. But any organisms that the kraut might have once contained had long since shuffled off their mortal coils and were no longer producing carbon dioxide. A lit match held above that briny mix burned brightly. Experiments with yogurt and sour cream were similarly disappointing, but then we hit the jackpot. On the bottom shelf, behind the bags of carrots and celery, sat a half-gallon jar of homemade pickles. They had been stewing in their own juices since August and tasted yeasty as well as sour, suggesting that fungi had joined the bacteria in their digestive pursuits. Frankly, it was far past time to throw the pickles out. But for once, procrastinating a chore had paid off. As soon as Noah and I brought a match near that open lid, the flame demonstrated why carbon dioxide is such a common ingredient in fire extinguishers. With no oxygen to burn, the match went out in an instant as if we'd flipped off a switch. What's more, smoke from the snuffed tip curled downward, trapped in the gas just as Priestley had described. It's pouring down the side, Noah exclaimed, watching as wisps of smoke followed the heavy vapors over the jar rim and then down to spread across the countertop. That's it, I told him. You saw the carbon dioxide. He quickly brought me back to earth. I didn't see the carbon dioxide, Papa. I saw the smoke. But like Priestley before us, we could use that smoke to watch the gas. defining its boundaries as it flowed and swirled around that open jar. And for a few minutes, our kitchen was filled with the thrill of discovery as we lit match after match, watching them snuff and smolder until all the carbon dioxide had dissipated into the surrounding air. Simple experiments often lead to broader insights, and repeating Priestley's fermentation trick brought up an obvious question. Do pickles cause climate change? Does making beer? The answer, of course, is no. But understanding why some carbon emissions are harmless while others are not reveals a basic truth about climate change that we rarely stop to think about. In the case of our pickle jar, the carbon came from the cucumbers in the brine, and the cucumbers had gotten it from the air around our garden the previous summer. Like plants everywhere, their growth relied upon photosynthesis, that leafy process of combining carbon dioxide from the air with water and with energy from the sun to create starches. In other words, carbon dioxide puts the carbo in carbohydrates. And when those starches break down, the carbon dioxide goes back into the atmosphere. This is the step in the Earth's carbon cycle with which we are most familiar, because we play a role in it every moment of every day. Whether we eat plants or eat animals that have eaten plants, the energy that fuels our bodies traces right back to those photosynthetic starches. And we release carbon dioxide with every exhaled breath. But in terms of climate change, breathing is like making pickles or brewing beer, guilt-free. That's because our bodies are just one short stop for carbon on its continuous circuit from the air through plants and animals and back again, with no net gain or loss. If that's all there was to the story, then the planet wouldn't be warming, and I wouldn't be writing this book or giving this lecture. The reality of modern climate change hinges on one key fact. Not all plants break down. Consider the pickle. Cucumbers eaten fresh or left to rot in the garden compost release their carbon right away. But that process slows down considerably in a jar of salty brine. Under the right conditions, it can stop altogether. In nature, this occurs primarily in two locations, the ocean floor and boggy wetlands. When marine algae die en masse and sink to the seabed, they sometimes get buried before they are eaten or decomposed. Dead plants in bogs can also accumulate with little decay, forming layer upon layer of peat. In either case, if sediments and rocks develop above and around these organic deposits, their carbon is effectively trapped. It is removed from the atmosphere and stored there for millions of years. Transformed by heat and pressure and age, we recognize those ancient plants now as the fossil fuels. Petroleum from the algae, coal comes to us from the peat, and natural gas, which can come from either. Burning them now returns all of that stockpiled carbon dioxide to the air at one time, overwhelming that natural cycle and leading to all the many consequences now unfolded. So I guess the take-home message from that story is that the next time you see something in your refrigerator that looks like a scientific experiment, it is a scientific experiment. There is a lot to be learned there, right in your own refrigerator. And it's a good reminder that even the atmospheric aspects of modern climate change are rooted in biology. So we know that the climate is warming and we know why, but what does that mean for plants and animals? As you can imagine, that is a booming field of study. Climate impacts are now so widespread in nature that it's not too much of an exaggeration to say all biologists are studying climate change. Some of them just don't know it yet. It helps to organize that deluge of information into themes. And one of the most common themes has to do with timing. And this takes us to Walden Pond, where the violets and the wood sorrel that Henry David Thoreau admired in May and June now bloom by late April. And what he called that early yellow smell of willows can reliably be savored in March. Spring is arriving earlier and earlier. You can see it happen in your own backyard. And if you write your observations down, as Thoreau did, they might one day become valuable. His meticulous notes on the plants and birds at Walden, unpublished and unknown, hidden away in museums until quite recently, they're now a vital baseline for modern comparisons. One expert told me that if Thoreau was listed as a co-author on all the papers now using his data, he would be one of the most prolific climate change scientists of the 21st century. But a modern spring isn't just earlier than what Thoreau saw. It's different. It's different. And to Thoreau, it might seem like a season in disarray. And that is because the plants are not, and animals are not responding in lockstep. They don't respond in the same ways. They don't respond at the same times. This flower is common in wildflower meadows throughout the American West. It is known as death camas. A marvelous, beautiful plant, but one that is toxic, highly toxic. Like many plants, it puts some form of poison into its leaves to ward off the nibbles of would-be attackers. But unlike other plants, or most other plants, it puts that stuff everywhere, even into its nectar and into its pollen. And what's more, that toxin, zygosine, is especially nasty stuff. It attacks the heart, it attacks the breathing, it attacks the nerve. I mean, it attacks even the digestive system goes wonky on zygosine. The plant's Latin name really says it all. The taxonomists got it right when they called it Toxicoscordion venenosum venenosum, which translates to poisonous bulb, poisonous, poisonous. So death camas is very well protected, but in terms of pollination, that puts it in a bit of a bind. I mean, how do you attract insects to your flowers when instead of a tasty reward, you're offering them seizures and paralysis and ultimately death? Well, enter the appropriately named death camas bee, one of only a handful of insects and the only bee that has learned to tolerate the poison in death camas. Now that gives the bee an exclusive source of pollen and nectar, and it gives the flower a very dedicated pollinator. It is a very tight, specialized, co-evolved relationship. But in many locations, death camas is now blooming 2, even 3 weeks earlier than it did just 30 years ago. It's responding to the warming air temperatures occurring in springtime, but the bee nests in the ground, where conditions are warming more slowly. It's still on the old schedule. And if that trend continues, it threatens to pull these two codependent species apart, not in space, but in time. We call those situations timing mismatches, and we worry particularly about these sort of specialized relationships where the partners in the dance are responding differently. But it's not just pollination that is affected. We are seeing it in all kinds of scenarios, including the Arctic, where caribou in migration are now arriving in some cases at their calving grounds past the peak of plant productivity. The plants have responded more quickly than the caribou, and when they arrive, they sometimes find a lack of
Thor, you have muted or frozen. Let's see what we can do here.
Their long journey. It can take years or decades, however, to sort out the implications of these complex relationships. There are other aspects, much more immediate consequences for plants and animals. I'm talking about extreme weather events, which we've all experienced all across the world, really, particularly in North America in the past several months, from heat domes to hurricanes to floods, you name it. And there's an interesting example that comes to us from the American Southwest, which echoes a comment I heard from one biologist who said, you know, sometimes it's really not that complicated. Organisms just get too hot. Now, you might think on the face of it that creatures living in the southwestern deserts would be well prepared for a warmer world, but that's not necessarily the case. This story comes to us from a fellow named Barry Sinervo, who is a herpetologist at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And he studies lizards, among them the fence lizard, the Western fence lizard, which, if your childhood was anything like mine, you tried and failed to catch on numerous occasions, because the fence lizard pulls away under a rock. Lizard enthusiasts. They are what biologists call heliotherms. They use the sun to thermo rocks when they want to warm up, and they go underneath the rock in the shade when they need to cool down. They can't stay out in the sun indefinitely because they cannot compensate for that increased heat, and they would overheat and perish. So they must stay close to rocks so that they can find shade when they need it. So as the climate has warmed and these desert locations have increased in temperature, the lizards have simply responded in the way they always have. On hot days, they just spend more time in the shade, but that comes at a cost, because the more time you spend beneath a rock, the less time you have to be out looking for food. So as temperatures have risen, calorie intake for lizards started to go down. And there is a critical point where that becomes a real problem, particularly for the female fence lizards, in that when they spend too much time in the shade, they don't get enough energy in their body. They can't store up enough energy reserves to reproduce, which means that as it gets too hot, the lizard populations stop breeding. And you really don't need the PhD in herpetology to predict the long-term consequences of that. Now, another climate change theme has to do with what fans of the Jungle Book might call the bare necessities of life. What happens when things that are this is really the scenario we allude to the bears for seals. And the ice sisters, the bare necessity, if you will, of their lives. But it turns out that that melting ice threatens other creatures as well. If you could look beyond the seals and the polar bears to the edge of the ice floes, you might see this little creature here, a beautiful little seabird called the little auk or dovekie that feeds along the edge of the ice floe where populations of plankton are particularly rich. And this has been their strategy for thousands of years. It worked out very well until the ice began to recede farther and farther north, away from the islands where the dovekies breed. Places like the Franz Josef Land archipelago in the high Arctic in Russia. So dovekies have long been predicted to be an early casualty of climate change, because as you can imagine, as that distance gets longer and longer, they have farther and farther to fly to find food to feed to their chicks. And at some point it becomes too far and they can't bring back enough food. Chicks starve, population crashes. This was the prediction until a group of scientists made an expedition to Franz Josef Land to study this in nature, which brings us to an important point, and that is that species are not passive bystanders to change. When their world changes, they do everything they can to respond, sometimes in surprising ways. So let's catch up with this expedition, this dovekey story, again, straight out of the book. It comes to us from a conversation with a French scientist named David Haskell, who participated in that expedition. We had indeed strong hypotheses and predictions on how they would behave, Haskell explained, noting that birds in their previous studies had regularly flown over 60 miles to reach the edge of the pack ice. We were expecting flight times between the colony and the foraging spot of at least an hour, and then recounted what he called, quote, one of the most exciting moments of my research career. Sitting with laptops at the dinner table, surrounded by their Russian counterparts, they opened a batch of tracking data and saw precisely how long the birds had been in the air. less than 4 minutes. Less than 4 minutes. Instead of trekking all the way to the edge of the sea ice, the dovekies had apparently found an alternative food source that was right on their doorstep. But what and where? It is easy to imagine the conjecture and excited conversation that came next, perhaps fortified by a sip or two of vodka. Soon, their ideas began to coalesce around a new theory. My colleague, Jerome Fort, remembered what we had seen while climbing the nearby mountain with our Russian friends a week before, Grimmelet recalled. Described a distinct line across the mouth of the fjord where cloudy blue meltwater from island glaciers slammed into the dark currents of the Arctic Ocean. Both Fort and Grimmelet had trained as oceanographers before they began studying birds, and they knew the consequences of such an abrupt transition. We both knew what that front meant, a curtain of plankton, killed by temperature and osmotic shock. For tiny crustaceans, swinging so suddenly from one kind of water into another was like driving full speed into a wall. And for anything that fed upon those crustaceans, the resulting pileup created a bonanza. Testing their theory, however, required a boat, and the only craft available at the research station was a chronically deflated dinghy. To add to that, the fuel they'd brought from Murmansk turned out to be contaminated with water. So none of this was ideal for exploring a polar sea, but they set off anyway and managed to sputter across the fjord far enough to conduct a survey. At first, they didn't see much, but as they crossed that convergence zone between the glacial melt and the ocean water, the dovekies were suddenly all around them. The little auks were all there, Grimmelet told me, aligned on the oceanic side, diving and stuffing themselves on plankton, easily picked from that underwater curtain. So with that revelation, the story of dovekies and climate change switched instantly from one of decline into one of resilience. Yes, the sea ice was melting, as predicted, but so were Arctic glaciers. And in places like Franz Josef Land, where the glaciers are plentiful, that created an opportunity that no coming. Grimmelet and his team spent the remainder of the field season showing that dovekies weren't just surviving on their new diet, they were thriving. To Grimmelet, the project demonstrated how one effect on the outcome. Even if you think you know, he summarized, you really have to get out in the field and check what wild creatures are doing, because very often they will surprise you. David Grimmelet's story embodies something that I heard again and again during my research for this book, how scientists went into the field expecting to study one thing and ended up studying something else because conditions on the ground were so different from what they expected. Different in terms of climate, but also different in terms of lives and the activities of their subjects. Dovekies were able to pivot quickly to a new food source because they have what scientists call plasticity, an idea that really is that old comic book character to any shape of a hat. We all wish that every species had just that sort of ability now because plasticity allows a rapid response to climate change. Some species have a lot of it, some species very little. If there were an Olympics of plasticity, the gold medal might go to this creature here, the Humboldt squid, that Karen mentioned in her intro. A marvelous animal in terms of its ability to respond, in that the people who used to fish for it in the Gulf of California had thought it had disappeared. It had just disappeared from these traditional places after a series of marine heat waves, climate-driven marine heat waves. Everyone assumed that the squid had up and left for cooler waters until they went out and did a survey and found that, in fact, there and more plentiful than they. But instead of responding by moving, they had responded with plasticity, changing what they eat, but also reacting to that heat. Their whole physiology changed. They lived for half as long, they reproduced in half the time, and under those constraints, their adult bodies could reach only a fraction of their former size. These are squid that could be 6 feet long, and now they were measured in inches. The few that the fishers had been catching, they'd been dismissing as juveniles or another species altogether. Most of them were too small to bite on the hooks they were using to catch them. So most of the climate change responses that we have measured so far in nature are some aspect of the dove key, the squid story, plasticity, this idea that species have a certain amount of flexibility built into their system, changing their habits, changing or realizing hints of actual evolution playing out in response to climate change. And a wonderful example comes to us from another lizard, this small one here, an anole that lives on the Turks and Caicos Islands in the Caribbean. And Colin Donahue, who's now at Washington University, but he was studying these lizards at that time as part of a larger project on the impacts of non-native rats. The Norway rat had invaded these islands, and they wanted to remove the rats and see the response in the native flora and fauna. So it's part of the team that went out and they measured the lizards, and they took and so let's pick up that story straight out of the book again. This comes from chapter 8, which also begins with a quotation. This Leopard by Giuseppe Lampedusa, who wrote, "If we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change." Actually, it was 2 hurricanes, Donahue clarified, when I called to ask him how the story played out. Hurricane Irma struck first, pummeling the eastern Caribbean with torrential rains, storm surge, and Category 5 winds exceeding 175 miles per hour. Just 2 weeks later, Hurricane Maria swept through with similar force. The combined storms devastated low-lying islands like the ones where Donahue's lizards lived, uprooting trees, flattening structures, and leaving both natural and human communities reeling. Needless to say, researchers put the rat project on an indefinite hold. But for Donahue, that also offered an opportune, perfect position to study the effects of hurricanes. Had any lizards survived? So, was that surviving population different from the one that he had just measured? We had no idea what to expect, he told me, but I knew we weren't going to get another chance at that kind of data. So he cobbled together some funding, headed back to the Caribbean, and found himself in a sort of scientific deja vu, repeating the exact same field project he'd just completed earlier. We were on a short timeline, so it was pretty much catching and measuring lizards all day long. Donahue, he described that trip with obvious pleasure. In conversation, Donahue's enthusiasm for science, working, and thinking long after other people might quit for the day and retire the poolside bar. That may be why he recognized the potential value of returning so soon to resurvey his lizards. And it's almost certainly why it occurred to him to bring along a leaf blower. The customs officer was very confused, he said, and laughed out loud at the memory of trying to explain the science behind traveling with a large piece of landscaping equipment. We didn't know how they might run for it or hunker down in the tree roots. We didn't know. Lizards in a real hurricane was out of the question. Donahue used the leaf blower to simulate one inside his hotel room. And I have to say, I've always wondered what the people in the next room thought about that. I mean, it's one thing if someone has the TV on about a leaf blower. My God. At any rate, Colin was kind enough to share with me a video of that experiment so that we can all see what he saw. And before I play it for you, let me assure you that no lizards were harmed. There's a soft net off camera that all of the participants, and they let me play for you a hurricane lizard. You can see the wind begin, the back legs free, and finally the lizard on any longer, and it's off camera. So in addition to getting quite a few hits when he put it on YouTube, this video explained perfectly what Colin had seen in his data, because it turns out that the surviving lizard population was different than the one he had measured just 6 weeks earlier. The survivors all had larger toe pads for clinging tight to sticks and branches during the windstorm, and stronger front legs for gripping. But they also had shorter back legs, and a mystery to him until he saw their behavior in Iceberg, having short back legs to drag on bodies just a few seconds long. And those few seconds could be the difference between survival or not. So he realized that in that short amount of time following the hurricanes, what he was able to measure was an example of survival of the fittest in action. Natural selection playing out not over the course of thousands of years, but within a single field season. So he went back later, the next generation, then he took a broader view of the question, looked at the whole Caribbean, and everywhere that strong hurricanes are more common over time, lizards have those traits. This is an example of climate-driven evolution. And Colin was there to measure it. So climate change biology is really full of those sorts of surprises. And I hope you will agree with me that there's a lot more to it than a bear on an iceberg. Now, this evening, we have been talking about the challenges that climate change creates, from mismatches in timing to extreme weather, and all responses from plasticity to even evolution. And I have to tell you, we haven't even scratched the surface. Consider movement alone, which is perhaps the most intuitive example of a climate change reaction. Plants and animals fanning out across landscapes and oceans to find the temperatures and other conditions they are accustomed to. Between 25 and 85% of all species are now moving in response to climate change. Even at the low end of that estimate, that's a quarter of all life on the planet. So it is creating upheaval into predation, hybridization. Many of these creatures have not interacted before in their evolutionary histories. It's also, of course, impacting things like extinction. The mouse-like brambletea melomes in Australia recently became the first mammal species confirmed as a climate change casualty when all of it. So studying climate change biology does not make scientists worry less about crisis, but it can help them to worry smart, allocating scarce resources to species that really need our help the most. And that's important at a personal level too. As we try to allocate our limited emotional capital to this crisis, we too need to know what to worry about. Yes, it is daunting, but I argue that climate change deserves our curiosity as well as our concern, because after all, it's hard to solve if you're not even interested in it. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions that you may have before our hour is up.
Yes, and I invite you now. Let me get my screen on gallery. You have an option. You can put your question in chat. You can raise your hand and pose it yourself. I'm just fascinated by how quickly these animals are adapting. That's the surprise. You always think of evolution taking hundreds of years, but it sounds like what you've presented to us is it's pretty immediate in some cases, correct? Or am I putting too much hope in what you offered us tonight? Like, are we all going to survive this?
There are situations where it can happen quickly, and that is It doesn't, unfortunately, we're not all like Plastic Man. If we all had that level of plasticity, then any species could respond quickly to this crisis. Plasticity is very unevenly distributed in nature. So not all species can do that. But where you see those quick responses, it usually comes from something that's already baked into the genome of the species. A great way to think about that in our own lives is to consider the recent Olympics and Paralympics in Tokyo, where elite athletes from around the world descended upon that city to compete. And many of them did so literally, because they had been training at high altitudes. And athletes will go to high altitude train because as you rise in elevation, the density of the air decreases. So every breath of air you breathe on a high mountain contains fewer molecules of oxygen, which is why you're out of breath when you first get up there. But our bodies have plasticity in that situation. All of us can do it. We adjust automatically by producing red blood cells, by changing breathing patterns unconsciously and blood flow until we can behave normally then, or at that elevation, adjusting to the lack of oxygen. So athletes will do that because when they return to sea level, those traits persist for some period of time. It gives them slightly more oxygen then when they're back in the dense air of sea level to their muscles, giving them a small boost. Level enough difference between winning a medal or not. And that is because we don't have to on a list of things now on a mountain must just with a plastic tube.
Thor, you're frozen and not. We're hearing every other word, and I know you're making your final point about this, and I don't want to miss it.
Oh, sorry, you guys. It might be because we have more cameras going or something. I'm not sure, but you're free on me a little bit too.
Are we fuzzy for you as well?
There's some freezing going on, definitely.
Uh-oh. Are there other examples of things that have been you've tracked in humans where we're seeing some sort of evolution over time that's related to climate change? Or, I mean, I know we're seeing where we're probably going to see even more movement, but I'm wondering about actual like physical evolution. Is it?
So she's frozen, but she's not.
Am I frozen now too?
Your face is, but your voice is going.
You weren't frozen for me though, Karen. I'm not sure.
I'm sorry. I don't know what's going on. I wish I could fix
a mixed bag.
It wasn't happening during your power presentation. Every now and then we missed a word, but it was really clear what you were talking about and your slides weren't frozen. Okay, Christy, if you turned your camera off, I want to hear you ask a question. You ready to mute? I'll turn my camera off too.
Has to do.
Pardon me?
Oh, that wasn't me.
Or can you hear us?
This is Christy talking, even though my face is still now. And that's a photo. That's not me frozen.
Okay. Let's hear a question from the biology teacher.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I was taking lots of notes. That was a really fun refresher for me because I've been looking at a lot of the same stuff again and again. So it's nice to hear fresh new ideas and information and stories about what's going on. And there's so many stories to read and think about. And I'm very excited to read your book. So I'll read your book. But I do want to ask if you, just as a teacher, I mean, I get standards that took 15 years at least to develop, probably 20 years if you start right from the beginning. If you could like zap into high school biology again, you mentioned what some of the things you learned in high school biology. What would you hope are some of the elevated concepts today with what you know today?
Oh, what a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, you know, in biology, many things boil down to evolution. And some of the things we've just been talking about, the distinctions between measurable selective direction of evolution and plasticity, things that are already baked in, the speed at which evolution can happen, how traits can wobble around a average, and they start to move. I think for me, evolution was just one of many topics in biology. But as I've gone on from high school through a career in this stuff, it really just is at the basis of almost, you think you're studying something else, and then by God, there's this fundamental evolutionary question that is driving the whole system. So I mean, just diving deeply into questions about evolution, I think that serves people well in any sort of biological or natural sciences career.
Thank you so much. That was very helpful. I appreciate that.
You bet.
Anyone else have a question that
yeah, this is Alan of Alan and Christine. There was an article in the Times last week or so about some creature evolving to deal with evolve with climate change, which I didn't read the article, unfortunately, just the headline. But in seeing the hurricane lizard, it's like they had evolved, but it didn't necessarily, they could have, their long fingernails, whatever, could have been a problem for them, but because the climate changed, they were the survivors. So it's an interesting, sort of aspect of evolution, is that we're theoretically all constantly making changes, but it depends on what else happens, whether your change is good or bad for your species. That's just a comment.
Yeah, well, it's a great comment because it also underscores for us in the world of conservation a challenge that climate change has created for our paradigm of how we protect species. And that traditionally we've gone out and always looked for the center of a species range where they are most, where they're common, the most common, and try to, draw a box around some good habitat there and save as many of them as we can. But in terms of climate change, what we're learning is that oftentimes it is the fringe populations out on the edge of a species range that are truly important, because they're already living, under conditions that are not right in the heart of the comfort zone. So if you have a species that's spread across a range of conditions in an era of rapid change, your conservation effort should be looking, in many cases, at those fringes where they may have the traits to survive, whereas the ones in the center of the range may not have those, what may seem like sort of odd traits, across the range of the species under stable conditions. Those fringe populations are suddenly looking very important from a conservation standpoint.
So in a sense, the creatures that are moving up the mountain are basically doomed, but the creatures that are somehow surviving down the mountain are the ones that will survive and will continue to populate. Yeah,
so that mountain analogy is good. It has to do with, and finding the temperatures that you're looking for, and it'll work for some species. The ones at real risk are the ones already at the top. Where do they go? And we can see those species suffering in a number of times now. And the same thing you see sort of latitudinally, species moving north in the northern hemisphere, south in the southern hemisphere. And it creates greater challenges for the ones that are already, at the top of the mountain, so to speak. But as one climate scientist, Greta Petzel, who's down at the University of Tasmania and just a brilliant, brilliant scholar, she reminded me that, if a species can move in response to climate change and survive, that is a good climate change outcome. And I think that's important to remember, because sometimes, at least personally, we all have favorite species, and we can see the changes in our world all over the place. And for me, here in the Pacific Northwest, there's a little songbird, a little kinglet that I've always loved, very common. It's getting a lot less common. And I've always thought, well, it's a northern species. It's probably diminishing, moving away, and then I realized after talking with Greta that while I should perhaps miss that species if it leaves where I live, I shouldn't mourn it, because it's got a place to go. If you look at the predictions for that species, there is habitat for it to the north, and it seems to be getting there. So in fact, that's actually a really good climate change story. So it helps us to understand this biology, not only from the standpoint of conservation and policy, but I believe also, at a personal level when we are trying to cope with this crisis.
Christy is posing another question. What are our next steps? A perfect way to end. What do we do where we live and with our understanding of climate change? What do we do?
It's a great question.
Concrete and tangible, because I want to do it.
It's a great question. We all play a role in this crisis by the way that we live and the demands and energy that we are upon this planet. Which is actually a good thing, because that means we can all do something about it. This question was posed to a wonderful biologist named Gordon Orions, who's in his 90s now. He's studied over the course of his career everything from blackbird behavior to the evolution of fear. Wonderful person. And he responded when someone asked him what a citizen should do about climate change. He just said, everything you can. Which I thought was a great response, because it captures not only the urgency of the issue, but also agency. Because of the word can, right? I mean, what we can do is relative to our circumstance. And luckily, there are things we can do every day in response to this crisis. We can control how we shop and how we eat and how we drive and how we vote and how we protest and the grass, how we do the laundry, and how we, turn off the lights when it's time to leave a room. All of these things are under our control, and all those small things make a difference. There are people, naysayers, who would tell you that, that personal action is meaningless in terms of a problem so large. But that is wrong, and not just slightly wrong. That answer is actually the opposite of the truth. Because what we're really talking about in terms of a solution to climate change over the long haul is a change in society, a change in our cultural relationship to energy, how we produce it, but also how we consume it, how much of it our lifestyles demand, and how we even think about it. And if you will allow me, with a name like Thor Hanson, it won't surprise you to learn that there are, a lot of Scandinavian jokes that float around in my family. And so I would close by giving you one on this topic about Ole, the old farmer in North Dakota, who was beloved by his family, lived a wonderful life. And when he was on his deathbed, everyone came, everyone gathered around in his bedroom to say their last goodbyes. And he looked up and he said, is Lena here? And they said, yes, Ole, Lena is here. And he asked if Olga was there, and Regina, yes, they're here, Ole. And he started going through name after name. And finally, they could see he was getting a little upset. And they said, Ole, everyone is here. The whole family is here with you in the bedroom. And he looked up and he said, then why is the light on in the kitchen? And I love that joke because of the gentle humor, playing upon the frugality of this old Norwegian farmer. But I also think it captures for us something that we've lost in terms of our relationship to energy, because something we used to consider as precious was 1936. And before that, people in rural areas didn't have electricity in that way. So when it came, it was a precious resource. It was a precious resource. You would never have a light on in a room with no people in it. It didn't make sense. And I think we need to recapture that appreciation of of not just electricity, but all forms of energy. We have been tricked by our lifestyles into considering energy cheap. Energy is never cheap. It never has been. It has never been cheap. It's only now that we are beginning to pay the bills.
Well, we so appreciate you tonight. Thank you so much for being here. Christine and Alan are saying that they can't wait to read your book. I encourage everyone to share what we learned tonight with your friends and family and invite them to go to Napa Book Mind's website and purchase the book, or come into the store and support our author who joined us here tonight to share such valuable information. It was really informative and fun and encouraging. I'm not leaving feeling like it's hopeless, because I could turn off a few lights in my house and make a difference tonight.
You can do it.
I can. And I can walk to work, which is also good. So nice to have you all here. Thank you so much for joining us. Good luck with your book. I know you have many other talks in the next few days, and it's going to be a success.
Thank you so
all
very much. It was nice to be with all of you tonight. Take care, everybody.
Take care. Good night, everyone.
Thanks so much, Tori. Thanks, Alex, for joining us too, our students.
Yes, thank you, students, for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen. Take care. Bye.
Good night.